Donald Trump wants factories to return to the United States. Virtually all of the US president's policies have revolved around this issue. And no, I'm not just talking about the tariffs. There's also the big, beautiful bill with tax cuts for domestic companies, along with the constant push to weaken the dollar. And do you know what? He's actually succeeding. However, you've got to be very careful when you make a wish because it might come true, though not in the way you intended.
America is in the middle of a stealth manufacturing boom.
The industrial sector is recovering in the US, and this is not only good economic news, it's also vital for the midterm elections. Remember that one of the reasons Trump wanted to bring manufacturing back to the country was precisely for electoral purposes. Over the past decade, many traditionally left-leaning industrial regions with a strong blue-collar vote have shifted their support to the Republicans thanks to the orange president's proposals. Trump won the last election by a narrow margin thanks to poaching these traditionally left-leaning voters, much like what happened with the Hispanic vote. Well, now this issue is once again front and center, given that there are legislative elections coming up this November, elections where Trump faces an uphill battle. But first, if you're interested in the world of investing, if you want to learn how to manage your savings, protect yourself against inflation, and figure out how to make money beyond your day job, I've got some news for you. At Visual Factory, we've created the Visual Factory Club, a newsletter where every week we send out free content focused on essential financial education, the ABC of what everyone should know to understand the stock market, financial markets in general, investment platforms, how to assess investment opportunities, and which markets may have more or less potential. Because of course, if you want to invest your money so you're not at the mercy of your country's economic instability, you at least need to understand the basics of the financial world. In the Visual Factory Club, you'll learn all of this completely free of charge. Through the link below and this QR code, you can sign up for the club and start receiving the upcoming editions. What's more, when you sign up, you'll receive a dossier where I explain, in a clear and simple way, the most essential investment concepts. What multiples or the PE ratio are, what indices are, ETFs, derivatives, funds, EPS, you get the idea. After that, every week you'll receive additional materials and market analysis to help you stay informed about what's going on. And by the way, the sooner you sign up, the better, since we send each episode of the series by email and every edition is unique. If you're not subscribed, you might miss some of them and you won't be able to access them later. With that said, let's get into the video. What's happening in the US is very strange. The economy is growing. That's true, but while this might seem like good news, it could actually be a sign of a problem. To understand why, I want to talk to you about the Kuznets curve. This curve, which corresponds to the graph you see on the screen, basically illustrates that extremely poor countries have almost no industry. That is why they are so poor. Think of Africa or medieval Europe. But little by little, they industrialize and thus become richer. However, there comes a point where the share of industry begins to decline. From this point on, countries continue to get richer, but industry declines in favor of services. In fact, a country like Spain, which is much poorer than the United States, has a much higher percentage of industry in its economy. And this happens in every country. There comes a point where having less industry isn't a bad thing. It's a sign of development toward the service sector, which generates more revenue. And that's why we say the US situation is so unusual. Until not long ago, Americans were following the trend of other countries, but in recent times, industry has started to increase again. Now, there's an even more unusual fact in this story. Since Trump entered the White House for the second time, the manufacturing sector has lost about 100,000 workers, while the rest of the economy has gained 300,000. In other words, even though the industry is growing in terms of production, it's losing workers. Furthermore, jobs have been lost in almost every sector of the industry. It's not as if just one specific sector is going through a crisis and that's it. The question is, what could explain all of this? Why is the industrial sector making more money but hiring fewer people? Well, at first glance, one might blame artificial intelligence and robotics, which destroy jobs while boosting corporate profits. But this theory has two major problems. The first is that the United States has very few industrial robots, and it doesn't seem to have stepped up its game in recent years either. We're talking about roughly 300 robots per 10,000 workers, well below Japan or Germany, with 400, China with nearly 500, or South Korea, with 1 robot for every 10 workers. What's more, almost all of these countries have installed more robots in recent years than Uncle Sam, and the share of industry in their economies has not risen. It has continued to decline, as expected. And as if that weren't enough, this argument has yet another problem. It is by no means clear that more automation means fewer jobs in the industry. Take the example of Japan.
In Japan, the decline in robot prices increased both the number of robots and employment by raising the productivity and production scale of robot-adopting industries.
Paradoxically, more robots means more jobs. How is that possible? Well, because technology can replace us, that's true. But if it can do the same work as us for less money, the product will become cheaper. Consumers will have more money at the end of the month, and they will spend that money on new things. Where do these new workers come from? From the new demand that arises precisely because robots have automated a task. In short, there's no evidence that the United States is betting on robots, but even if that were true, it wouldn't explain why the industrial sector is growing while hiring fewer workers. So what's going on? Well, in order to answer that, we have to look to the only developed country in the world that seems to have revived its industrial sector, a country with a disease similar to that of the US, Singapore. Since 2020, Singapore has been reviving its industry. Because yes, even though it's well known for its financial sector, its manufacturing sector carries more weight than that of Germany or Japan. In recent years, the government has pushed a plan to create something like a Taiwan 2.0. Tax cuts, loans with very favorable terms, land grants. The government began offering all of this and much more to companies that invested in high-tech manufacturing, particularly in the semiconductor sector. And here's one important detail. This industrial niche is very capital intensive and labor sparing. Semiconductors are the clearest example. Even a relatively simple microchip can require more than 350 steps to manufacture, all with nanometric precision. And it's clear that a human isn't going to be able to come close to that. And now let me ask you something. Do you remember which sectors destroyed the most jobs in the United States? That's right, computing, electronics, and machinery. Computing and electronics echo what happened in Singapore. On top of that, these are the sectors where industrial production has grown the most, partly thanks to subsidies from Joe Biden's CHIPS Act. Machinery is an exception, because there are still many humans working in this sector. But we can't draw many conclusions either, since almost all the change is explained by two very specific companies, SpaceX and Boeing. SpaceX, for example, combines automation with almost artisanal production, with a highly skilled engineer devoting all their attention to one specific part. And Boeing's sales are soaring, excuse the pun, thanks to geopolitical tensions. It's selling 70% more jet aircraft than 1 year ago. With all this, we already have a good idea of what's happening. It's not that American industry is simply resurging, rather it's shifting toward products with high added value but very little human involvement. In this chart, you can see in which sectors industrial production has increased and in which it has fallen. Production of electronic goods has skyrocketed, but imports have also grown significantly, a sign that domestic industry cannot keep up. In contrast, in the automotive sector, a more traditional industry, the opposite is happening. Production has fallen by 3% and imports have dropped another 14%, likely due to tariffs. Overall, this isn't really such a big surprise either. American industry was already heavily focused on high value added products. I'm sure many of you have seen videos of 100% automated factories in China, which don't even need to have the lights on because there are no humans involved. The United States doesn't have such flashy facilities, but every worker in the US industrial sector produces 4 times more value than a Chinese worker. The key isn't having the most futuristic factories, but selling the best products. What's more, do you remember the statistic that the US has very few robots per worker? This is often cited as evidence that American industry is highly inefficient, but the opposite is true. In reality, the US focuses on highly advanced products that are typically produced in small quantities, so it's not worth automating the process. It's a somewhat more artisanal process, as we mentioned earlier, except that instead of traditional artisans, you have to imagine top engineers working with futuristic machines. Machines that are highly advanced tools, not replacements for other workers. Of course, this isn't the entire story. Between 15 and 20% of American industry is food processing, and there aren't any products with extremely high added value in this sector. What it does have is a lot of cheap labor, especially from immigrants. Meanwhile, it's not just that China doesn't have many immigrants who are poorer than the local population. Many poor Chinese from rural areas can't leave their villages without losing their pensions, government healthcare, or even their homes. On the other hand, for historical reasons that aren't relevant here, Chinese universities are churning out engineers by the truckload, so it makes sense to focus on machines and increase automation. In conclusion, in the United States, what we're seeing is a polarization of industry. On the one hand, traditional industry, which relies heavily on labor, isn't growing as much. In fact, in some cases, it's shrinking. But on the other hand, we have the high value-added industry such as semiconductors. This is the industry that is growing the most. But the problem is that this growth does not depend on workers and therefore does not translate into jobs. Herein lies the key to this whole issue. And if you've noticed, we haven't even mentioned tariffs, because what matters is this structural shift in the economy that goes far beyond Trump's policies. And you might be wondering, what impact have the tariffs had on all this? Because as it stands, if Trump's goal was to win votes by creating jobs in factories, that's not happening. Well, on the one hand, metal production is growing strongly, and imports of these products have fallen by 30%, a very clear sign that the production boom is due to tariffs. But the truth is that these products represent a very small part of the industry, and in general, tariffs make the supplies used by other companies more expensive. Or to put it another way, the cost of tariffs causes factories to produce less because they have higher costs. So no, Donald Trump's tariffs aren't achieving their goal. The industry is growing, but only thanks to sectors that aren't very labor intensive. This is simply bad news for the midterm elections. After 2 years, there are no more jobs in industrial areas. As we saw in previous videos, the US economy is in a very fragile state, and it's possible that if the situation doesn't change, those former industrial areas that switched their vote to the Republican side may decide to return to voting Democrat. In any case, now that we've reached this point, it's your turn. Have you been surprised by the industrial resurgence in the US and what lies behind it? How do you think the economy will affect the midterm elections? What should Trump do to turn the situation around? You can leave your answers down in the comments, and don't forget that here on VisualEconomik, we upload videos every week, so subscribe so you don't miss any of the new ones. All the best, thanks for being there, see you next time.